let's start. Okay. Let's start with South
Yes,
Korea.
sir.
Yoon was arrested, kind of arrested.
Mm,
He surrendered himself, and now he's saying he will cooperate with the legal procedure. Okay. But he's still the president.
mm,
Can you unpack those whole thing
yeah.
for us? What is going on here?
Well, I can't fully unpack it because there's constitutional and legal issues here, which I'm not able myself to unpack. I mean, I don't understand whether, for example, being a president, being the actual constitutional president, still gives you immunity. I mean,
Mhm.
apparently it doesn't in South Korea. But the fact is, and this goes directly back to something you put to me in a program that we did about South Korea a couple of, about 1 or 2 weeks ago, just after the crisis began, that it was very, very bizarre that after the failure of the martial law decree and after the impeachment vote in the South Korean parliament, that Yoon was still hanging on as president. It made absolutely no sense that he would want to hang on. And in fact, he not only tried to hang on, but he has systematically obstructed the impeachment proceedings. He won't appoint judges to the Constitutional Court. He's the person who was the acting president who nominally took over from him and who is from his own party also refused to appoint judges to the Constitutional Court. So they were both trying, in effect, to sabotage the entire impeachment proceedings. Then Yoon simply refused to cooperate with the investigation. Then, when officials came to meet him in his residence, apparently he turned his security detail on them and had them forced off the premises. Then there was a standoff between Yoon's security detail and the police and the prosecutors. And in effect, what's now happening in South Korea is this utterly intransigent behavior by Yoon and his attempt to basically cling on to his position as president has provoked, has led to what is in effect a power struggle. And the opposition, who appear to control part of the judicial system and the investigative forces and the police, and who clearly now have the political initiative, have been able to break through and win a decisive advantage by having him arrested. I mean, they broke into his residence. His security detail this time was not able to prevent his arrest. In fact, he accepted that he had to be arrested. He would be arrested. And he's now saying that he's going to cooperate with the investigation, which I don't believe he will, by the way. I think he's going to continue his policy of obstruction and not answering questions and all of that kind of thing. But in a way, these events deepen the crisis in South Korea even more because instead of a proper, orderly, collaborative process in which the president does something, he gets impeached for it, an investigation is set up. The president says he will accept the outcome of the investigation. What we've got instead is a power struggle. And power struggles in any country are dangerous things. And in
Mhm.
a country with the history that South Korea has, it's a particularly dangerous thing. We can't say that this is over.
Yeah, that it's kind of like a stalemate, right? He's not going to resign until
No,
he has to go,
no,
but the opposition are not giving up,
yes,
right? And in the meantime,
no.
he seems doesn't have the real power, but he's still the president. But the opposition, they don't seem to have real power either. I mean, they're not president, but they have some control of something, but not the real power as the president. So it's very strange. The whole dynamic is I think even unprecedented for South
Well,
Korea.
well, it is completely unprecedented for South Korea. I mean, the Russians have an expression for this. They call it a system of dual power. When there
Okay.
are two within a state, there are two bodies, which each of which claims authority and legitimacy, and in effect cancel each other out, because that's what we have, and what you've just described is a power struggle. It's a situation where one side uses those forces that it controls to try to oust and outmaneuver the other. They're in a zero-sum game, because if the opposition were to hold back and not take ever more radical action against Yoon, given that Yoon is the president, there is a risk of power would flow back to him, in which case he might conceivably try and order another martial law decree, or get whoever was acting president, assuming that this person was still associated with Yoon, to order another martial law decree. So the opposition can't risk that, so they can't afford to appear to back down or to be weak, and that is driving them to take ever more radical steps to counter the very radical steps that Yoon himself is making. It's a classic example of the fact that every constitutional system, democratic, undemocratic, whatever you want to call it, it can only work if all of the players who are involved in it agree to play according to the acknowledged set of rules. When there are no rules, you get power struggles, and that's what's playing out in South Korea at the moment.
We just have to continue to see. He might even survive, because the court right now needs, I think, 6 judges. They might not have 6 judges to approve that, so he might survive it.
Correct.
But if that happens, he will be a very weak president, right?
Well, he will be a very weak president, but also a very dangerous one.
Okay.
Because he will have survived an impeachment process, but he will know that he has no prospect at all of being re-elected, and that his opponents are, there out to get him. And then it becomes possible that he will try to do the same thing all over again. So what may happen, and this is a possibility we can't ignore, is that the opposition are now they are now also in an all or nothing situation. They have to get this impeachment proved. So they've got to either pressure the Constitutional Court judges to approve it, or put more judges into the Constitutional Court to ensure that they have a majority. And again, that might be done in a lawful way, but legal processes are not really adapted to this kind of urgency and haste. So, as I said, we're looking at a breakdown of the constitutional system in South Korea, and another coup is a real possibility. There must be people in the military who are very, very nervous about what is going on, and obviously a certain embassy also very, very nervous about what is going on. And there could be wide consultations and discussions and all sorts of things going on that we have no idea about. And it's not impossible that in a week, in 2 weeks' time, we could see a major crisis.
We'll just have to see. 2025 seems like an interesting year. Start with a lot of interesting.
Very, very interesting year.
Okay. Sullivan has been giving interviews. I sent you one of the links, right, that he had with the PBS, but he also had a lengthy one with the New York Times, pretty much the same talking points. What is your impression? Is there anything new other than the regular, the same talking points? Okay, Russia, they have to help Ukraine to defend themselves, and they have to help Israel to defend itself, and China is in danger. That's why they have to help Taiwan with their weapons, so that they are the one who keep the peace in the Taiwan Strait. I mean, are there anything new stand out?
Well, there was nothing exactly new, but that doesn't mean that these interviews, and those Tony Blinken is also giving, aren't interesting and important. Because after 4 years of complete failure, and I mean, when I say complete failure, I mean not just failure in wars, Ukraine and Afghanistan and all of that, but failure in the effective conduct of international relations. these people have learned nothing. I mean, they could have said all of these things on the first day that they started their jobs. I mean, they've learned absolutely nothing. They've learned nothing about China. They've learned nothing about Russia. They've learned nothing about the Middle East. They don't appear to accept that they've done anything really importantly wrong. I mean, they still continue to cling on to all the old mythologies and fantasies and things of that kind. There is no retrospection, no discovery of insight, no sense here of a learning curve or a learning process. They are just, well, people who, if they was in for another 4 years, would just do more of the same, even though it's failed.
It's interesting. Yes, he's talking about everything as success, right? And so one thing I noticed that the PBS interview is less so, but in the New York Times, he actually repeatedly emphasized the success they have in Afghanistan, because in his view, that's a good example of they themselves achieved peace. I find that's remarkable considering how bad the whole pullout was, right? How embarrassing the whole thing. But that seems like one of the things he thinks that he's very proud of. What do you take
Yeah.
on that? Is it
I mean, well, I mean, again, I find all of that completely bizarre. If there is a peace in Afghanistan now, which the sort of is, it is no thanks to Sullivan, Biden, or Blinken. I mean, they didn't achieve it in any conceivable way. The decision to pull out of Afghanistan had previously been made by Trump.
Mhm.
They botched it. They made a complete hash of it. That's the first thing to say. The second is that we've got peace in Afghanistan because the Taliban won. I mean, the other side, the side that the United States opposed, had won. Now, when I say the United States opposed them, the Biden administration opposed them. The Obama administration opposed them. Administration after administration had opposed them. At no point in time did Sullivan come forward and say, well, actually, we've really thought about this and we do understand that the situation in Afghanistan is that the only party that's able to bring peace to the country are the Taliban, and they do appear to have support amongst the people of Afghanistan. And what we need to do, therefore, is to arrange a negotiated transfer of power. Now, that would have been impossibly controversial in the United States. But if that had happened, and if Sullivan had been able to say, well, we were right. Events have vindicated us. We did this. They did this very controversial thing, but we could see that the situation in Afghanistan has stabilized. Well, then I can accept that would have been a success. But this is not any kind of success. It is a disastrous failure by this administration and by all its predecessor ones, going all the way back to George W. Bush. I mean, it's pretending that you won a victory when everybody else can see that you suffered a disastrous and humiliating defeat. And can I say, if this was all such a great success, why does the United States still freeze all of the central banks, the Afghan central banks, financial assets, denying Afghanistan the money that it needs to move forward with its own reconstruction?
I wonder whether he still want to portray himself and the Biden administration in general as some kind of peace-loving people. But they cannot find any good examples, because after they come to power, it's war everywhere, the Middle East and in Europe, and so that is the one example I guess he could point to as some kind of proof that they love peace. Is that what he's trying to prove here?
Yeah,
I wonder.
I think that is exactly right. Because most people, including most people, I believe, in the United States, prefer peace to war. So you don't want to be the warmonger, warrior president. You want to be the peacemaking president. And what else? Where else is the peace? There is no peace anywhere else. I mean, the promised negotiations in Ukraine that the Biden administration was telling us would happen, in which the Russians would capitulate, but they've never taken place. Nor have negotiations in the Middle East proved at all successful. So for all of these reasons, they are coming up with the only example where there has been peace, even though it is a peace achieved in spite of them, not because of them. just to say.
Yeah. About Russia. So recently, Biden administration put in more sanctions in the Russian's energy sector, including two of Russia's largest oil producers. And also we talked about the shadow oil tanks and the shadow ships, stuff like that. So, and he was asked why they did it now and not earlier. And his answer was, okay, because the oil price today is much lower. If we do it like 18 months ago, it would hurt the US consumers because then, the inflation would be too high. I have to look at that. That's not true because if we say 18 months ago, in June 2023, the oil price at that time was $70 per barrel. Today, it's $75 per barrel. So it's simply not true. And then he said,
It isn't true.
Yeah. And then he said this, he said, what we're giving the incoming team, the incoming administration is a real leverage in a negotiation as they set up for diplomacy. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, this has been what, the 16th round of sanctions? I mean, I can't remember how many sanctions after sanctions. What all of these sanctions on the Russian energy sector, which go all the way back to 2022, have achieved is to make the price of oil and gas higher than it would otherwise be. And that is contributing to overall inflation. And these latest sanctions will increase that inflation even more. Joe Biden himself admitted as much. He said that these latest measures would increase the price of gas, that's, petrol, at the petrol stations in the United States by 3 to 5 cents. So already that narrative is completely exhausted. Will it pressure the Russians? No, it won't, because the Russians, if they were going to succumb to sanctions pressure, would have done so 3 years ago, not now. I mean, they've shown that they have the ability always to adapt and readapt to every one of these sanctions. And what these sanctions are going to do is that they're not going to give the Trump people more leverage. They're going to give them less leverage because the Russians will be more angry. This is what is inevitably going to do. Now, what's actually going to happen? Because this is a world that I know a little about. I mean, I used to work peripherally in it, in the world of shipping and maritime insurance and oil trades and things of that. Remember, I'm Greek. And once upon a time, I knew lots of Greek ship owners. I don't anymore. I'm not part of that world. But I can tell you, this is one of the toughest, roughest, most ruthless businesses that exist on planet Earth. I mean, the people who own ships and move ships around are people, men, they're nearly always men, with nerves of steel. They are just 1 inch away from being sort of gangster types in many cases. They will always look to where they can make the most money. And if there are risks, not only will they take their risks because this is inherently already a very high risk business, but they will know how to hedge against those risks. They will know how to change the names of their ships. They will know how to play around with the flags of the ships. And despite the fact that superficially it appears complicated to change flags, you can do that very quickly and very easily if you know the right people in the right places. And of course, there's always more ships. You get some ships sanctioned, but then you will always find other ships. You'll always find crews in various ports. This trade is going to be barely affected. Before March, there's not going to be any effect at all because all of the contracts, all of the deals have already been done. By the end of March, the oil that's already on the high seas will have reached its destinations. After March, by the time March comes, already most of the work will have already been done to find ways to adapt to these latest sanctions. And by midsummer, this will all have been resolved. But we will have a situation where there are more middlemen, there are more payoffs, there are more of that sort of thing going on, except in those countries which simply refuse to accept the sanctions at all, and where direct business can continue, which is China, and its trading deals with Russia. India also to a certain degree.
Mhm.
And that means that the Chinese and the Indians will get oil for less,
Mhm.
pay less for their oil than the Europeans and the Americans do. The Russians will get more, by the way, because as oil prices rise, as more of their oil gets traded at higher prices, they also will benefit from the higher prices.
Yeah, if there's money to be made, I mean, there's always a way, people will find ways.
There's always way, exactly. People will always find. You can't stop. You can't stop the trade in arms, the illegal trade in arms. You absolutely haven't been able to stop the illegal trade in narcotics. I mean, look at how much people have tried. Are you really going to stop the trade in oil?
Mhm.
I mean, it's impossible. Not against a player as big and as sophisticated as Russia is. It just can't be done. And it's incredible that people don't understand this.
And I just read something interesting that even now Ukraine said that they stopped the Russian gas to Europe. Turns out they haven't, because the
No.
gas the the gas has been paid by, for example, Slovakia already paid for it, which means the gas belongs to
Yeah.
Slovakia. It doesn't belong to Russia anymore.
Yeah.
So Ukraine cannot just
Yeah.
stop it because it's not Russian gas. So it turns out that that's how it
Yeah.
works. I just find that interesting.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly, and I understand that gas is returning to Transnistria again. I'm not sure how this is being done, but apparently they've also started to resume to receive Russian gas again. Except maybe it's not called Russian gas. I mean, I simply don't know.
mhm,
But that is again, it is the reality of the energy markets. You can arrange you can bring in third party players.
mhm,
You can have the Indians buy the gas in Russia.
yeah,
Seriously, they will then sell the gas
yeah,
to the Europeans,
mhm,
and they will tell the Ukrainians, well, it's not Russian gas,
yeah,
it's ours. Of
mhm,
course, what you then do is that the Indians buy the gas of the Russians. That creates a middleman,
mhm.
and the middleman will then pass down some of the extra cost of his middle fees to the end customer. As I said, all it does is it puts more pressure on prices. That is all it is going to do.
Mhm. Not only that, I mean, they're trying to also sabotage the Turk Stream, apparently.
Yeah,
Lavrov pointed out that they have taken down some drones from Ukraine,
yeah,
and so Ukraine has been trying to sabotage that. Now, when they
yes.
do that, aren't they upset Turkey? I mean, Turkey needs those money, right? So they're not afraid to upset Turkey?
Well, it is incredible because some weeks ago, a group of a set of documents, memos within Kiev, were leaked, um, discussing something that took place in 2023 when there was an attempt then by the Ukrainians to sabotage Turk Stream, to actually do the same to Turk Stream that they'd done to Nord Stream, to send divers to plant whatever it was, blow up Turk Stream. And some officials in Kiev contacted the officials within Kiev who were responsible and said, are you mad? You really want to do this? You
Mhm.
really want to antagonize Erdogan, who has up to now been somewhat sympathetic to us? I mean, this is an insane thing to do. But you see that Ukraine, as it gradually goes down, as it goes down faster and faster, those people within Ukraine who are most desperate and most reckless are prepared to take greater and greater risks, and they're prepared to take these risks. And as you correctly say, antagonize Erdogan.
And going back to this interview, he was asked that how come they don't sanction Venezuela? And his answer is kind of interesting. For example, there is a U.S. company, Chevron, is, I guess, doing business there and getting oil there or something. So he asked Sullivan, why not just cancel the license for Chevron to get oil from Venezuela? And he said, well, Trump tried that. It didn't work under Trump. But somehow sanction Russia under Trump will work, but sanction Venezuela won't.
It's crazy. I mean, can I just say, before sanctions started to be imposed on Russia back in 2014, before 2014, the Russians and Exxon had done a massive deal on developing oil resources in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. And this actually was very controversial, I remember, in Russia itself, because there were quite a lot of people lobbying in Russia for the work on developing those oil fields to be agreed with Chinese companies. Mm-hmm. This is, of course, before the Ukraine crisis began. And there was word out at that time, and I remember this, in Russia itself, that the Chinese were very unhappy that Russia had gone for an American company in preference to a Chinese one. And it turned out that Exxon had many friends in Moscow. And the man who had led the whole thing was the man who eventually became Trump's first Secretary of State. I can't remember his name, but probably you can, your people. Yes, Tillerson, Rex Tillerson, exactly. He was apparently the point man who'd negotiated that deal. And then, of course, the sanctions were imposed by Obama in 2014. And sure enough, Exxon pulled out. So if Exxon pulled out because sanctions were imposed on Russia in 2014, I think it is inconceivable that Chevron would stay in Venezuela if Venezuela was sanctioned in the same way. It just won't happen. Wouldn't happen.
Yeah, but they don't have consistency. I mean, they go.
No, they don't have consistency, and they lie all the time. I mean, they lie, just as you discovered. And by the way, thank you for finding that out. I mean, they lie about the oil price situation 18 months ago. And they lie about, Chevron. I mean, they're just lying all the time, which is very tiring, but they do it compulsively.
Yeah, it's actually one thing he also lied here, the New York Times, when he talking about China. So he said, when I talk about China, I speak about two truths. One truth is that China is trying to surpass the United States as the world's leading power economically, technologically, diplomatically, militarily. President Xi Jinping has said so. Xi Jinping never said that. No, I don't think he ever said that.
He has not only not said it, he has said the exact opposite. He has actually had meetings with US officials, and we have all the text of those meetings. They're there on the Chinese Foreign Ministry website, in which he has repeatedly gone out of his way to say China is not seeking to supersede the United States, to surpass the United States. That is not what China is about. That is to misread us entirely. But you're absolutely right. He's just lying again.
They must have convinced themselves that's exactly what China wants, to the degree that they believe Xi Jinping has said something like that. Because the foreign ministry spokesperson also repeatedly said that our goal is to surpass ourselves, to become the best of China. We don't see anybody else as competitor, as threat or anything. We just want to be the best of ourselves. They repeatedly said that also. So
you see, this is the trouble, Sophia. I don't think that they really believe that Xi Jinping has ever said anything like this. I mean, remember, we are talking about the National Security Advisor of the United States. I assume that whenever Xi Jinping says something that touches on US-China relations, it will be translated, and the text will be passed to Jake Sullivan and to Tony Blinken and to whomever. So I think they are pretty well informed about what Xi Jinping has actually said, and the same about what the Chinese Foreign Ministry actually says. It's their job. Mm-hmm. So I think, to be honest, that they are lying again when they say that Xi Jinping has said that. I don't think they seriously believe that Xi Jinping has actually said anything like that. What I think is true, and this goes back to our conversation last week, is that I think that though they know perfectly well that Xi Jinping has never said anything like that, I think they believe that that is secretly what Xi Jinping actually wants, that he really is aiming for world domination. Because, again, as we discussed in our previous program, in China's position, that is exactly what the Americans, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and all of the rest would be doing. It is incomprehensible to them. It is impossible for them to believe that China, in the powerful position in which it is in today, would not be seeking world domination. I mean, there just isn't a possibility that they can conceive.
And he also lied about the Ukraine war. He said Putin want to wipe out Ukraine from the map. Putin never said anything like that, and never
No.
made showed any evidence that he wants that. But he also, yeah.
Well, he's gone out of his way repeatedly to try to avoid that very possibility.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the truth of it. And I'm going to say this. I mean, there is now an increasingly nihilistic approach appearing in in the policy of some people in the West about Ukraine. I get the sense that they would actually prefer Ukraine to be destroyed, simply to make events correspond with their lies. The fact is, Putin has gone out of his way repeatedly to try to negotiate a stable compromise.
What is very remarkable is, of course, you talked about that the Americans have very selective memories about things,
Yeah.
right? So when they talk about Ukraine war, it just started in February 2022. Anything happened before that, not of any significance. And when you
Yes.
talk about the Middle East, the Gaza crisis also started October 2023. Nothing before that matters.
Yeah.
And one more thing I find interesting is that when he talk about China, they like to bring up this fentanyl thing, which they blame China for not working with the United States. But here's the deal. First of all, fentanyl actually has some legitimate usage. So when China sending us fentanyl to the United States, it is the customs job, Chinese custom job to differentiate, okay, which are legitimate, which are not legitimate. So it's extra burden, extra work for China without anything in return. China get nothing out of it, right?
No.
But even so, China was working with the United States on this until Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. That's when China got angry and China said, we're not doing this anymore. But he never mentioned that. Nobody in the US administration ever mentions Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan angered China and put a stop
No,
to
of course not. No, of course not. Exactly. I mean, that is exactly correct. I mean, I just wanted to quickly add again, as a historical fact, that for Westerners of any kind to start lecturing China about drugs and the trade in drugs is pretty rich, if I may say so. I mean, I mean, of course, I say that especially as a Briton, where, in fairness, those who do know about the events of the 1840s in Britain, they will always admit that this is something which I will say about British people. They do admit that was a very dark moral page in our history, which we don't want to talk about very much, but there it is.
And also, actually, the US was part of the opium trade too, which I didn't
Absolutely, of
know
course it was.
before,
Yeah, of
right?
course it
The
was.
US,
Or they
yeah.
all were. They all were.
Again, if there's
And then they pretended that it was a Chinese problem. And you read all these late 19th century books in which there's so-called opium dens in London, and of course they're always associated with the Chinese, who are in fact the victims, the victims of this thing, and the dealers were of course the British.
Yeah.
this is again how the whole history of all of this is written. I didn't know this about the fentanyl trade. I didn't know that the Chinese basically no longer worked to differentiate types of fentanyl. um, until Nancy Pelosi's visit. That doesn't surprise me at all. I could completely understand why the Chinese became so angry over that. I did know that fentanyl has actual uses. But again, I mean, given the realities about illegal drugs, not just illegal drugs, but drugs generally in the West, to blame China, of all places, for any part of this problem is ridiculous. Now, in my own city, which is London, um, I'm going to say it. If you came here and you looked around and spent any time really looking for evidence of drugs use, you will find it everywhere. I mean, it's unavoidable. I mean, you walk in parks and you could smell it. You see people dealing in it. That's not because China is behind it. It's because there are major structural problems within our society. We've been sucking in drugs from more and more places around the world, from Afghanistan, from Latin America, from wherever. And the fentanyl trade is just a part of it. And we produce a lot of the drugs ourselves. I mean, the Netherlands, again, I used to be, when I was at the High Court, I knew all about this. The Netherlands was a major producer of synthetic drugs, which were used in the British and American dance scene, for example. She talked about the Netherlands, the government of the Netherlands, deliberately or intentionally creating, an illegal trade that was going to corrupt and destroy the West. I mean, that was absurd, and it is equally absurd to talk about China as being the source of this problem. I, by the way, absolutely agree. If there were good relations between the United States and China, and the Americans came along and they said, look, to the Chinese, in the context of those good relations, look, we have a problem here. We're not suggesting that you are the cause of the problem, but we do have a problem. And the fact that there is this trade with fentanyl from your country, it's playing a certain contributory role. And can we work out something together? It would be done. Of course it would be. Anybody who knows what the Chinese authorities feel about drugs, and I remember seeing all the signs in Shanghai airport, for example, all directed, by the way, at Westerners. Anybody who knows about that would know that there is no question that the Chinese authorities, with their knowledge of Chinese history, would act decisively to assist any Western country that approached them on this question in good faith.
Yeah. I think the Chinese government is pretty sympathetic to any country who has this problem because of its own history. So China was working with the United States on this until Nancy Pelosi's visit.
Absolutely.
But every time when they talk about the fentanyl, China is sending those fentanyl to the U.S., they never mention that. They never mention Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
Absolutely, they never do. No, absolutely. I mean, it's never mentioned at all. If you read all these articles that appear in our media about China, never, ever, ever do they talk about Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
In conclusion, he said this because when he was asked, how he sees his tenure, he said, I ask myself some pretty simple questions. Are our allies stronger than we found them 4 years ago? Yes. Are our enemies and competitors weaker than when we found them 4 years ago? Yes. Have we kept the United States out of war? Yes. Are the basic foundations of American power more robust and resilient today than 4 years ago? Yes. So I believe we are handing off a very strong hand to the next team. What is your take?
Well, he's either lying or he's delusional because he's wrong on every conceivable count. I mean, he absolutely is. I mean, talk about how his allies are stronger. Which allies? South Korea is in a political crisis. We just described it. Japan doesn't even have a proper functioning government at the moment. Europe, deindustrialization crisis, economic problems. The militaries in Europe stripped down because they sent all their weapons to Ukraine in a war that is being lost. In the US having suffered massive political damage, not just over the Ukraine war, but because mostly of the out of control actions of its own ally Israel in the Middle East.
Mm.
What planet is Sullivan on? If he really believes all of this,
Yeah.
I'd say the truth is the diametric opposite in relation to every single point that he made on that list.
One can even argue 4 years ago, I mean, China and Russia wasn't even US enemy, right? So
No.
he's saying we weaken the enemy. Well, 4 years ago, I don't even think that these are regarded as US enemy. I mean, competitors and rivalries, but today he basically, labeled these countries as enemies, I guess. So that itself, I think, is pretty bad, I think.
That is an excellent point, actually. That is an absolutely excellent point. And again, in fairness to Jake Sullivan, I mean, he's not the only person here. But why talk about Russia and China as enemies?
Yeah.
10 years ago, they did not want to be enemies of the United States. Before the Ukraine crisis, the Russians were cutting deals with Exxon, as I've just said. China
Mm.
had I mean, people even talked about a symbiotic relationship between China and the United States. They used to talk about Chimerica, all right, all very exaggerated, very wrong, misunderstanding a lot about China. But the point was, China did not want to be an enemy of the United States. It repeatedly said so. Russia did not want to be an enemy of the United States. It repeatedly said so. Today, people like Jake Sullivan call them enemies, which is to some extent, I wouldn't call them enemies, by the way. I would call them adversaries,
Mm-hmm.
which is a slightly different thing. But a relationship which was once looking as if it would become cooperative has become adversarial instead. And that is entirely the product of US foreign policy, including, of course, that part of US foreign policy that Jake Sullivan has managed.
And it's not limited to China, Russia. Actually, on Monday, the Biden administration proposed some kind of framework for AI chips ban. And that
Yeah.
framework actually include 120 countries. It's not just China, including European countries, including even Israel. So they are going to have very limited export of AI chips, apparently.
Mm.
So what is going on here? Do you think they are so afraid of they're losing this AI war or something with China or something that they don't want any chips to get out of the US? Is that what it
Oh,
is?
so self-evidently, that's exactly what it is. There's no other explanation for it. They are now prepared to prevent development of these technologies amongst their own allies because they worry that if they don't, the technology will leak to China, which is actually in reality ahead of the United States in this technology. I mean, this is what makes it all so bizarre.
Yeah. Um, and I also want to talk to you about the fire, the big fire in the Los
Yeah,
Angeles.
yeah,
Um, what is happening is I mean, we shouldn't be surprised by now because
no,
before this, there was East Palestine, the train derailment. And the Lahaina also had a big
mm,
fire in Hawaii.
mm,
So by now,
mm,
we shouldn't be really surprised.
no,
But the difference is there are a lot of rich people's houses was under fire and,
mm,
burned
mm,
down, basically burned
mm,
down. And of course, in China, the contrast was Xizang, the Tibet, had a earthquake about the
yeah,
same time, shortly before the fire. The
mm,
reaction from the Chinese government is so swift and like 24 hours, everything, they restored the electricity, they restored internet access, the phone services, and of course they took in 50,000 people with provide them with a hot meal and
mm.
warm bed and stuff like that. Whereas in LA, I think it's still going on. The fire is still going on. We don't know when
Oh,
it's
yeah,
going.
absolutely.
So, what is your take on this whole thing?
I should first of all say that I have two very, very dear friends who have their home right in the middle of this fire. I
Oh,
mean, they're not there. It's not specifically. It's there's three fires in areas, a sort of triangle around the area where their actual home is. So it hasn't yet been burned, but
mhm,
they've been evacuated. So I'm hearing what people are saying. I'm hearing what these people are saying. They are furious. They feel
mhm,
deeply betrayed. And of course, as you absolutely rightly say, we've had the story in the United States again and again, going all the way back to New Orleans and the
Yeah.
flood that happened under George W. Bush's time. And nothing is ever improved. I mean, we have these problems constantly come back. And the explanation isn't difficult to find. It's because the governments in the United States, not just at the federal level, but on the state level, and we're talking about California, which is, a huge state with
Mhm.
enormous resources, no longer are concerned about the welfare of their people. In China, clearly the government is. Clearly the government sees its role as looking after people. In the United States, it barely does. It's much more interested in other things, in power in Washington, in the lobbying that goes on in Washington, in winning elections, in conducting intricate foreign policies in all kinds of places around the world. It's no longer focused on what is the business of government in most places and for most people.
Now, in China, when natural disasters strike, they always deploy troops. But that
Yeah.
doesn't seem that's the thing in the US. They
No.
rarely ever deploy troops. Why is that? That deploying troops, is that a big deal? I mean, why?
Well, I think it is, but I suspect one of the problems, and I say this bluntly, is that I think the military are opposed to this because they know
Um,
perfectly well that their troops wouldn't really know what to do in these kind of situations. I mean, what I've been hearing about the state of the American military is that it too is barely functional anymore. I
mm,
mean, remember a few months ago, they were supposed to build a harbor in Gaza, and that all fell apart. I mean, you don't really want to get those people there. If the federal government sends troops to LA and it all fails,
okay.
it's the federal government that gets blamed. Better leave it, to Gary Newsom, and he takes all the blame, and the mayor in Los Angeles takes
Mhm.
the blame. I mean, fundamentally, it's all about buck passing. And I really have to say this. I mean, the levels of corruption in America now are very great, and
Mhm.
they have clearly undermined the efficiency of the institutions that are supposed to protect and deal with these sort of crises. One gets the sense that people are elected for completely the wrong reasons because they know the right person and because they paid the right amount of money. They themselves see their role as elected leaders in completely different terms from the ones that elected leaders normally do. So, I mean, again, the contrast is with Rudy Giuliani in New York on 9/11,
Mhm.
and I can't remember her name. Is it Bass, the mayor in LA, who whizzes off to, is it
Mhm.
Ghana or someplace, to attend the president's
That's right.
inauguration there?
Mhm.
And they see their role in completely different terms, and
Mhm.
I'm afraid self-enrichment and admission into the wider political class is part of that. In China and in other countries, not just China, Russia, for example, and I can say this: if a governor, I don't know what a top official, regional official is called in China. In Russia, he's called a governor. If a governor fails and it's exposed that they've been corrupt in this kind of situation, they get sacked. And they not only get sacked, they get prosecuted.
Mhm.
So it's more dangerous to be that way. Sometimes, even if you are a bit corrupt, you make absolutely sure that some things that you do are, run properly, precisely because you don't want the authorities coming down and looking very carefully at what you've been doing. But in the United States, the political class doesn't care because they tolerate and even approve of corruption amongst themselves.
Mhm. Accountability, then. I think there's an absolute
Uh,
lack. Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
you've got the right word. Accountability has broken down.
Yeah. I wonder also, there's a lot of discussions in China as well that there's a two. philosophical differences in terms of you see the government, right? So in China, it is true, like the Huangdi, throughout the Chinese history, they are really almost like a god's figure up there that if you look at the palace, right, they are sitting with a distance to the people and everybody kneel down. And in some cases, you're not even allowed to look at the emperor. So it's very strict. But the expectation is, okay, you get a lot of special treatment, all the privileges, and high up, and but you need to deliver, which means you're also head of the family. Meaning, when something happens, natural disaster in particular, you need to take care of your people. And when you don't do that, people do rise up. Whereas in the West, the idea, this kind of like a freedom. Okay, you have all the freedom, right? You can freely criticize and calling your president names or what have you. You can do whatever you want. But when something happens, you're on your own. Don't count on the government. There's a little bit that kind of Darwinian view, not only, plays in the international. We talked about, big countries, they always, believe in power struggle. But even in domestic policies, up to individual level, there's that view. Okay, you have the freedom, but don't count on anybody. Is there something?
I think there is a lot of truth to this. Let's turn to China first. No other country has a history as long in disaster relief as China does. I mean, if you are familiar with Chinese history, you will know that this has been a recurring fact about Chinese history. Again, if I can just discuss this, I do so with, as a Westerner, and I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert here, but my understanding is that the very first dynasty, the Xia Shang,
Yeah.
was it the Xia
So,
Shang Zhou?
so, uh-huh.
Yeah, the first dynasty, the first person who the person that created it was Yu the Great, who
Mm-hmm.
mastered the flood. I mean, and
Yeah.
this was why,
Yeah.
because he was able to master the flood. In other words, engage in tremendous disaster relief. People
Mm-hmm.
said that he needed to have that role, and that was how the first dynasty was created. Now, that may be a myth, but
Mm-hmm.
a myth that tells you a great deal about the outlook of the Chinese people and their expectations of what governments do.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since then, if you look right through Chinese history, you see of these giant works that Chinese governments have done, I mean, which still astonish,
Mm-hmm.
whereby they control the floods in what we call the Yellow River, at least in English. I don't know quite how it's called in Chinese,
Yeah,
but I
that's
mean, the massive amount of work there, the building of canals, the hydraulic works, all of this. It is very, very much a part of the Chinese outlook that is what Chinese government does, and not just as the level of the Huangdi, but throughout the whole structure. The same with famine relief, by the way. China was far more advanced than any Western country through nearly all of its history in disaster and famine relief like that. And this is very much, again, a reflection, as you said, of China, the Chinese people, the Chinese society, always thinking of itself as a family, as a collective, as the Russians would say,
Mhm.
coming together to resolve these problems together, be it building, a great wall,
Mhm.
controlling the flood, doing any of those other things. And and I think this is probably an oversimplification, and I'm going to apologize to your Chinese viewers about this, but we have this thing. There appears to be this idea of the mandate of heaven,
Mhm.
that if the government, if the emperor isn't doing these things, then he will lose the mandate, and the voice of heaven is the voice of the people. So there is this level of control. This is my own understanding of China. Now, if I'm wrong here, as I said, I apologize. But
No,
I
no, you're
think that
correct.
the point,
Absolutely. Mhm.
the points that you're making, I think, are absolutely true. In the West, we do not have that. I mean, the Roman emperors did engage in some degree of disaster relief, but on nothing like the scale that you see the Chinese do. I mean, it was never structural in Western society. And you're absolutely correct, partly because we've been so fragmented, partly because the stress has been so much on individualism, the individual over the collective and the family, that we've never really developed that within our own psyche. And the result is we're not as good at this as Chinese people. I mean, you remember last week we talked about hardwiring, how the Western societies are hardwired to war. They're also hardwired to rivalry and competition. Competition at every level, including within the state, within the nation, between individuals, the individuals who make up the nation, as opposed to working together as a team. Again, to understand these things, a knowledge of history and a knowledge of culture is important. Now, the one thing where I do actually slightly disagree with you, again, this is based on my reading of Chinese history, is that to my knowledge, it was not that unusual for Chinese scholars, to actually criticize the Huangdi if they thought that he was acting inappropriately. So there's always been this willingness to engage in criticism, which also exists in the West. There's also much a question of, we have freedom to criticize, and in China there's less of it. I get the sense that in China there was always every bit as much criticism as there was in the West. It is rather that the objectives of the criticism were different. In China, it was always about moving together, whereas in the West, the criticism is always, don't encroach on me.
Yes, you're right. I mean, yes, it is expected that the high officials will probably not necessarily, you can call it criticize, but reminding the Huangdi, right? That you have a role to play here. You have obligations to your people. So this famous saying is, water can carry a boat, it can also capsize a boat, right? So that's
very interesting. I'll try to remember that one, actually.
Yeah, and that is the mentality, and that's need to be reminded all the time to the emperor, to the Huangdi, don't forget that, right? Because for your own sake, right? Otherwise people can, capsize the boat. So whereas I don't think that's the mentality people have in the West. It's more like you're on your own, right? And you swim or sink.
Yes.
Yeah. Because like I don't know if you remember, 2021, there was a storm, a winter storm in Texas, very bad. So there was many days of like a power outage. So one of the Colorado city mayor, Tim Boyd, he said on his Facebook post, he said, only the strong will survive and the weak will perish. Now, he later was resigned because of this, but he actually, I guess, is certain type of mentality, pretty representative, I guess. He just said it out loud, which maybe many people think it that way as well, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest and all of that, which is an actual philosophy that was very, very influential in the West, and still is, starting from the late 19th century. I mean, it is completely alien to the Chinese way of thinking. I mean, no one in China, no philosopher in China has ever thought in that way. None. I could say that from those that I know about.
Which is why, this one, the Colorado City mayor's statement got lots of attention in China. People were like, what is he talking about?
Yes. Well, the whole Western approach to economics is another example. I mean, laissez-faire. Let anybody, just let everybody do whatever they want, and that's the way you get the optimal result. Again, it's not the way the Chinese think at all. And then when they don't think that we get very angry, and they say they're not playing by the rules. There it is.
Yeah. And he even said that's, socialist. So if you think that way, if you expect something from your local government, that's socialist. He said that.
Yeah, well, that's it.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the Tom Tugendhat, his visit to Taiwan. I understand he's very anti-China. Why
Yeah.
is that? Is there any particular reason?
Well, I don't know why he is. I mean, he's, I think, a very typical example of the British class, the political class. I understand he's ex-military.
Okay.
He comes from a sort of landed gentry background. He's
Hmm.
been to all the old schools. He
Hmm.
speaks, a certain type of English, which is the kind of English I speak, by the way, which sets him off as being a member of the political class. I think he has all of the usual simplistic concepts about China that so many people in the West have. And also equally simplistic ideas about Taiwan, that it's this great flourishing, a wonderful democracy that we should support. And he's just, I mean, if you read his articles, and he writes extensively, by the way, I mean, you read him every day in the Telegraph almost, even though he's a politician. He's a member of parliament. He was briefly considered a possibility as leader of the Conservative Party. So, we're talking about a man of some influence. He is absolutely internalized this belief that China is this sinister totalitarian state with a project for world conquest, and we must resist it with everything we've got. So this is what it is. So he goes to Taiwan. He's going to forge alliances with Taiwan to resist China. But the interesting thing also, and this is from a British side, is that the other reason why he does that, and it's probably not one that he's exactly thinking, but it is there, is that you go to Taiwan, you are rude to China, you invite Chinese attention, and that makes you and Britain feel important in some way.
Attention seeker. Okay.
Attention, so much about British foreign policy over the last 30 years is about attention seeking, especially the last 10.
Um, okay. Now about the Germany is going to have
Yeah,
election right next month.
yeah,
It seems like AfD has been continue to increase. Their
yeah.
polling numbers are getting better. But right now, CDU, CSU still have 31.5%,
Mm,
and AfD is close to 20%. When I
mm,
look at their spread, it's not clear CDU will definitely have the majority. Is
mm.
that how it is?
I think most people at the moment think the CDU will not have the majority,
Okay.
so they will have to enter into a coalition. And with every day that passes, the IFD seems to gain some traction.
Hmm.
And the reason they're doing that is because this is a complicated party with many strange people in it and some really very unpleasant people in the IFD. I don't want to pretend that there isn't that side to them too, because there is. But they are actually telling people how things really are. That Germany's in a bad economic place, that this quarrel with Russia has been a disaster, that the Ukraine war is a disaster, that cutting off Russian gas was a
Hmm.
disaster. They say all of those things. On Russia, they're pretty good. On China, not so much.
Hmm.
And again, I'm sorry to say this, I think the racist element
Yeah.
again plays a role. And I think we have to acknowledge that. But anyway, the point is they are gaining traction. The CDU is most unlikely to get a majority. The question is, if it doesn't gain a majority, how does it form a government?
Hmm.
um, if it's going to be a right-wing coalition, there aren't going to be any right-wing coalition parties that it can ally itself to, because to the extent that the IFD is a right-wing party, which it is, by the way,
Hmm.
and it would logically be a natural ally of the CDU won't touch it. So more likely than not, they will have to go into coalition with one of the parties of the current coalition, the
Wow.
SPD or the Greens, perhaps even both. depending on how well the AfD does, in which case we will end up with exactly the same government, essentially, that we have now. Very, very little will change.
Which means even though AfD may have more seats and more support, but they won't be part of the government, right?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
There will be a major effort made to exclude them. If the AfD is able to break through to the point that it cannot be prevented from either forming the government or participating in the government, that is a revolution in Germany. That will be a fundamental moment of change in German politics. It will mean the breakdown of the political order of the Federal Republic of Germany as it has existed since the 1940s.
Okay. It'll be interesting then. We'll see.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Very, very, very dramatic events are happening in Germany, playing out in Germany. Germany has a real politics, which Britain, for example, doesn't. So the fact that the AfD is breaking through in the way that it is important and interesting. It's a much more radical party than Reform UK in Britain is. Just saying.
By the way, the new Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch.
Badenoch, yeah.
Yeah. What can you say about her? I mean, Britain still have two parties, right? Even though the Reform Party has some tractions, but it's still two-party system. So what are your impression about this new Conservative leader?
She's, I think, more of the same. I mean, she ticks all of the boxes, which is why they voted for her. I mean, she's said very right-wing things, which appeal to the very right-wing base of the Conservative Party, which is who elected her leader. She's also black, which appeals to some people because they think that it will win back black support. But most people who listen to her and have observed her think that she's a very mediocre politician and an unimpressive personality. And she's been leader of the opposition for several weeks now. And the general consensus is that she's not broken through. She's not made a big electoral breakthrough, which, given how unpopular the government is something that people say she should have done.
Yeah, and my understanding is that Keir Starmer is really not that popular, right? So
no, he's not. He's not. He's very unpopular.
Okay. TikTok. So the ruling, the Supreme Court ruling some people saying can issue a ruling as early as today, so maybe this afternoon we might find it. But in any event, so most people, based on their the questions that the judges asked, there is a consensus that it's going to be banned. The Supreme Court will go along with whatever the government wants. In light of that, there's something very interesting happened. There is a new term called the TikTok refugee. I don't know if you heard about that. No. So the idea, of course, Mark Zuckerberg lobbied really hard for the TikTok ban because he wants all the people goes to Meta, goes to Facebook, and other his company. But the people in TikTok are so angry, they picked another Chinese app called Rednote. So they flooded Rednote. They downloaded so many apps, from the Apple App Store that it was number 28 or something, and just straight to number 1 in a matter of like 48 hours. Crumbs. That many people, TikTokers, went to download Rednote, and it is 100% a Chinese company. It has the Chinese government definitely have more control over it. It's not like there's a overseas version versus the Chinese version. No, there's just a Chinese app. And it's absolutely stunning to me because the name Rednote actually in Chinese it says 小红书, literally means little red book. It cannot be more communist than this. It cannot be more Chinese than this, but they picked one. I have to say, I give to the TikTokers, the young people. They actually very resourceful, and they really are angry. Obviously, they are. So this is a big giant middle finger to the U.S. government, isn't it?
Absolutely, of course it is, and and by the way, to the Supreme Court of the United States, if it does make this very, very bad decision, if I can say. But no, I absolutely agree, and anybody who knows how the internet works, by the way, but also how people who are on the internet, how they would respond. I mean, it does surprise me that it would happen on this scale, but that some people would do this, that does not surprise me because I can absolutely understand why they would be very, very angry. What has TikTok actually done?
Hmm.
I mean, nobody has yet told me
Hmm.
what TikTok has done that has been a problem. It's provided young people, especially, mostly young people, with an opportunity to express themselves. We might not always like the way they express themselves, but that's what young people do. They want to express themselves. It's provided them with a platform where they can do that. It's been very successful. It's worked extremely efficiently. And now it's been taken away for no obvious reason or cause, or because of national security concerns, which have never been proved by
Hmm.
anybody.
No. Well, actually, the Intercept actually reported that State
Mhm.
Department, the Biden administration give exceptions to some people in the State Department. They actually allowed to continue to use TikTok after January 19th. It's actually very interesting.
One wonders what for, actually.
Well, and
Anyway, never mind.
according to the Intercept, so right now they have a rule for government, federal government and its contractors.
Mm,
You cannot have TikTok on your devices, supposedly.
mm,
But the State Department have two exceptions. One is that there will be continued to people to monitor the
mm,
international TikTok. So those
mm,
people are allowed to have their TikTok continue. And also
mm,
apparently they have lots of contractors. They contract the content creators apparently working basically for the State Department. Those people are allowed to
goodness.
continue to create content. It's pretty obvious. It's for propaganda, isn't it? Right?
Absolutely, that's exactly what it is. That. I mean, to be honest, I find that all rather sinister, actually.
But the thing is, if they're doing that, then how can you justify, okay, TikTok is so dangerous, right? And it's a you allow your own people using it. And that they all, not to mention Biden and a whole bunch of other people who are for the TikTok ban, they all have TikTok accounts, on TikTok as well. So
Yes.
if you say it's dangerous, why are you having an account yourself there? So
Well, it doesn't make any kind of sense. But of course, the point is that it does ultimately have its purpose, which is that the United States, the authorities in the United States, only want social media platforms in the United States which are American and they can control. They're
mm,
very happy with other social media platforms around the world, provided that they control them also. And that's
yeah,
that's that's what this is all about. It looks to me like an attempt to control TikTok outside the United States. So you ban it in the United States, and then you maintain a presence and a role with TikTok, and try and project it overseas too.
yeah. But here's something else also happened. That this
Mm,
little red book, the Rednote, because it's so Chinese, right? Of course, the website itself was totally surprised by this whole thing. The company was
mm,
shocked by what's going on. But it is a lifestyle more than anything else. I mean, I have an account, and the things that push to me are about travel, about food, about
mm,
interior design, those sort of things.
mm.
So uh, it's interesting in the sense that the people who coming from TikTok, they actually get to see China. They get to see the real Chinese. And so they discovered two things. One is the Chinese people are very nice.
Yeah.
That because they're saying they call themselves, oh, here we are, the TikTok refugees, and the Chinese people say, oh, you're welcome here, enjoy yourself here, and
Mm.
then there were some people even saying, oh, there's people there even never met me, said, hey, if you come to this and that town, let me know, I'm going to buy you a meal or something like that. They were so unprepared for this kind of a nice.
I'm that doesn't surprise me at all. Actually,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So they're saying we're not going to fight China. If my government
Yeah.
has started a war with China, we're not going to fight.
Yeah.
I'm not going to fight the nice people there. And the other thing
Well,
is,
Go on, go on, go on.
The other thing is that they also surprised at how advanced China is,
Yeah.
in terms of the transportation and also well-stocked supermarket and very affordable. So they also surprised to find out that. So I find that's very, very interesting.
I find that very interesting too, but again, that doesn't completely surprise me. Now, first of all, just a few things to say. When you try and start to suppress all kinds of channels, then people do search out for them and look
Mhm.
for them. And if you lived through the Cold War in Europe, you will have found that that was so. So you went to the Soviet Union, people were listening to the BBC because the government didn't want them to. So that's not completely surprising to me that this dynamic is playing out. Um, about people discovering things about China that is unexpected to them, that is going to make the authorities extremely nervous. that I can definitely say, because I noticed it some years ago, back in 2018, during the World Cup, which happened in Moscow. That the
Mhm.
British government was actively trying to dissuade British football fans from going to Moscow
Uh-huh.
at that time, just to say.
Yeah.
And when they did go there were many of the same reactions that you've just described. People were really surprised that they were going to modern cities, that the
Mhm.
transport networks were good, that the food was fine, that the people were nice. It came as a really great surprise because every day, relentlessly, they're being told something else. And
Mhm.
it was about China even more so
Yeah.
because again there is the cultural difference. There's the sense that these are Asians, so they can't possibly live up to the standards of what we have in the West. And that does come as a surprise, and it does change people's perspectives.
Yeah. What I find interesting is that we talked about that US government doesn't understand China. I have to say,
No,
I feel like sometimes, many times, the US government doesn't even understand its own people. I mean, why
no,
do they, to pick up this fight with the TikTok users who are
yeah.
American? Why do they pick up this fight, right?
Well, that actually is a very good question because TikTok is no conceivable threat to the United States. It's never been used by the Chinese government as a propaganda tool. It never has been.
Yeah.
I think that the American government was afraid that it might be, but the fact is, China has never shown any attempt to do
Interesting.
anything like that at any time. So why worry about this? But they do,
Hmm.
because again, they have this this ingrained belief that because we use our social media in a certain way,
Hmm.
China is going to use its social media in the same way,
Hmm.
and not recognizing that the social media is in fact different. They don't understand that their own people are responding to it in a different way.
And we can say it's totally backfired, this whole
Yeah.
TikTok ban thing. That I mean, it's so interesting. There were people saying, there were a lot of videos on TikTok saying goodbye to their Chinese spy. It's just absolutely hilarious.
Yeah.
And there were people saying, I signed up to Rednote and I use my social security number as my login so that my Chinese spy can get promoted faster. It's just hilarious things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then there has been people saying that in the past that the Great Chinese Firewall is not necessarily to protect China. It's probably protect outsiders from the Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, because there are 700 million active internet users. I don't know if there is no firewall. Everybody come out and go to over the place and giving comments on
Yeah.
anti-China rhetoric on YouTube. I'm not sure YouTube can handle that.
No, absolutely. Well, can I just say, I mean, about this, I mean, we don't officially have anything like a firewall in the West, but
Hmm.
in practical terms, we do. I
Hmm.
mean,
Yeah.
when did you ever see Chinese social media platforms? When were they ever available to any extent to Western users? I mean,
Hmm.
they exist. Doubtless, there are ways to reach out to them, but it's never facilitated or made possible. Just saying. Mhm.
Yeah, by the way, there's still also misunderstanding that China bans Facebook and
Yeah.
Actually, Facebook was in China for a while,
Yeah.
but China has its own rule, the censoring rules
Yeah.
and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's Google and Facebook, they refuse to follow the Chinese law, Chinese rule.
Well,
That's when
that's
they
right.
have to leave. So
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, whereas TikTok has been getting out of its ways to try to
Yeah.
accommodate special requests from the US government.
I,
So
I, I think I think given what we've discovered over the last 10 years, again, for us to complain about other people's censorship is
mm,
pretty rich. just
yeah.
just 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 to say.
But I have to say it's a great thing to see actually people contact each
Yeah.
other, communicate
Absolutely.
directly.
Absolutely.
And they
Absolutely.
are they are Chinese kids that are saying, okay, here's my English homework, can you help me out? And then there's Americans saying, okay, here's my math homework, can you help me out?
That's amazing. That really is that is wonderful actually. That
Yeah.
is that is absolutely wonderful. Mm.
And it's given me hope,
Yeah.
despite of the
Yeah. Yeah.
populist government we have, but the people, we all realize we are the same, we want the same thing, right? And so it's nice that there's channels now that people discover by themselves to reach out to
Absolutely.
each other. I think it's a wonderful thing.
I completely agree. I absolutely agree. It is still hilarious that they're reaching out through the little red book. That really is hilarious.
Yeah. Okay. With that positive note, let's
Very
conclude.
positive note.
Yes, and we talk next Wednesday. Thank you so
Next
much.
Wednesday. Have a great week. So,
You
Sophie.
too.
See you then. Right.
Bye.
Bye.